Imagine waking up in a jail cell. You are wearing clothes you don't recognize. Your hands are cold. And there is a police officer sitting across from you asking you why you did it. You ask, why I did what? And he tells you that you killed your mother or your husband or your best friend. You laugh. You think it's a bad dream. You tell him that's impossible. I was asleep. I took my pill. I went to bed and I was asleep. And the officer looks at you and says, we know you took the pill. That's why we know you did it. In the late 20th century, a drug was released onto the American market that promised something simple. It didn't promise to cure cancer. It didn't promise to stop heart attacks. It promised sleep. It was a small blue oval-shaped pill. It was supposed to be the perfect sedative, fast, acting, no hangover, a miracle of modern chemistry. But it wasn't a miracle. It was a landmine. This is the story of a drug that rewrote the definition of criminal insanity, a drug that was hidden behind a wall of corporate secrets so thick it took decades to crack. And it is the story of how one company, the Upjohn Company, which eventually became a crown jewel in the Pfizer empire, turned a sleeping pill into one of the most controversial and destructive substances in medical history. They told us it would help us rest. Instead, it woke up the monsters. To understand the crime, you have to understand the motive. And the motive here wasn't just money. It was exhaustion. By the 1970s, America was a tired nation. We had moved from the physical labor of the farm to the mental grind of the office. The anxiety of the Cold War, the inflation, the noise of the cities. Nobody could sleep. For decades, the answer had been barbiturates, drugs like Seconal and Nembutal, doles as they called them in Valley of the Dolls. The problem with barbiturates was simple. They were too easy to die on. You take a few too many, you drink a glass of wine and your heart stops. Marilyn Monroe, Judy Garland, Jimi Hendrix. The body count was too high. The pharmaceutical industry needed a sequel. They needed a drug that could knock you out but wouldn't kill you if you took two instead of one. Enter the benzodiazepine. You know them today as Valium, Librium. But in Kalamazoo, Michigan, at the headquarters of the Upjohn Company, a chemist named Dr. Hester Jackson was working on something new. He wasn't just looking for a drug that calmed you down. He was looking for a hypnotic, a pure sleeping pill. Upjohn found it. They called it triazolam. But the marketing department gave it a name that sounded like peace. They called it Halcyon. Halcyon was a masterpiece of chemistry. It was incredibly potent. While Valium was measured in milligrams, 5-10 milligrams, Halcyon was measured in points, 0.125, 0.25. It was a sniper rifle compared to Valium's shotgun. And the best part, it had a short half-life. That was the pitch. Barbiturates left you groggy for days. Valium stayed in your system for a week. But Halcyon, you take it at midnight, it knocks you out, and by 7:00 a.m., it's gone. You wake up fresh. You wake up ready to work. It was the perfect drug for the Reagan era, the perfect drug for the go 80s, efficiency, speed, no consequences. The FDA approved it in 1982, and overnight it became the most prescribed sleeping pill on the planet. President George H.W. Bush took it. Rockefeller took it. Your neighbor took it. At its peak, doctors were writing 7 million prescriptions a year. Upjohn was printing money. They had solved the problem of sleep, or so they thought. The reports started coming in almost immediately. But they didn't come from the hospitals. They came from the police stations. In Utah, a woman named Ilo Grunberg, 50, 7 years old, a loving mother, a grandmother, wrote a prescription for Halcyon. She was having trouble sleeping after the death of her mother. She took the drug. She took it as directed. And then on a sweltering night in June, she killed her 83-year-old mother. She shot her 8 times. When the police arrested her, Ilo Grunberg was confused. She didn't remember doing it. She didn't know why she would do it. She had no history of violence. She had no motive. She just had a bottle of blue pills and a dead body. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across the world, people taking Halcyon were reporting bizarre side effects, amnesia, paranoia, hallucinations. They called it the Halcyon madness. People would wake up in strange places. They would drive cars while asleep. They would cook meals they didn't remember eating. But it was the violence that terrified the regulators. In the UK, psychiatrists started noticing that patients on Halcyon weren't just sleeping, they were becoming aggressive. The Dutch government was the first to pull the alarm. They banned the drug in 1970, 9 just months after it launched there. They said it turned citizens into zombies. But in America, Upjohn fought back. They fought back with lawyers, and they fought back with science. This brings us to a man named Dr. Ian Oswald. He was one of the world's leading sleep researchers. He started looking into Upjohn's data, and what he found was terrifying. He discovered that the short half-life, the very thing that made Halcion a bestseller, was actually its curse. Because the drug left the body so fast, the brain would go into withdrawal every single night. Think about that. If you take heroin, you get sick when you stop. With Halcion, the users were going into mini withdrawals between doses. Their brains were rebounding anxiety, panic, confusion. But Dr. Oswald found something else, something worse. He found Protocol 321. Protocol 321 was a long-term study Upjohn had conducted in the early 70s. They had given the drug to prisoners, which was common practice back then, to test for side effects. The results of Protocol 321 were a disaster. The subjects became paranoid. They became aggressive. Some of them had psychotic breaks. So what did Upjohn do? Did they tell the FDA? Did they warn the doctors? No. According to the internal documents that eventually came out in court, they cooked the books. They had technical assistants transcribe the doctor's notes onto new forms, and in the transcription, things got lost. A note that said patient feels like killing someone might be checked as nervousness. A note that said patient is hallucinating spiders might be filed under restlessness. They sanitized the insanity. They buried Protocol 321 in a vault. And they sold the drug anyway. By the late 90s, the heat on Halcion was unbearable. The lawsuits were piling up. Ilo Grunberg, the woman who killed her mother. The charges were dropped. The court ruled she was involuntarily intoxicated by Halcion. Upjohn settled with her for millions of dollars to keep the documents sealed. But the brand was damaged. Upjohn needed a way out. In 1990, Upjohn merged with Pharmacia, and then in 2003, the giant arrived, Pfizer. Pfizer bought Pharmacia and Upjohn for $60 billion. It was a massive consolidation of power. And with that purchase, Pfizer acquired the legacy of the sleeping pill. They acquired the patents, they acquired the lawsuits, and they acquired the lessons. You see, Upjohn had another drug in the pipeline, a cousin of Halcion. Its chemical name was alprazolam. You know it as Xanax. While Halcion was the sleeping pill, Xanax was marketed as the anxiety pill. It was chemically very similar. It hit the same receptors in the brain. The J-bar receptors, it worked fast, it hit hard. But Pfizer and the Upjohn legacy learned from the Halcion mistake. They didn't market Xanax as a hypnotic that would knock you out cold. They marketed it for panic disorder. They created a disease, panic disorder, to sell the cure. Before Xanax, panic attacks were seen as rare. After Xanax, they were everywhere. And unlike Halcion, which had a terrifying reputation for violence, Xanax was seen as chill. It was the drug of the rapper, the drug of the housewife, the drug of the stressed out student. But look at the data. While the world was focused on OxyContin, while we were watching the Sacklers, the benzodiazepine crisis was quietly building in the background. Xanax became the most prescribed psychiatric drug in the United States, and it became one of the deadliest. Why? Because of the synergistic effect. If you take an opioid like OxyContin or fentanyl, it slows your breathing. If you take a benzo like Xanax or Halcion, it slows your breathing. If you take them together, your lungs just stop. You don't gasp. You don't choke. You just fade to black. The CDC data shows that in over 30% of opioid overdoses, a benzodiazepine like Xanax is also in the system. It is the silent accomplice. It is the getaway driver for the opioid killer. And Pfizer, they rode the wave. Xanax became a $1 billion blockbuster. Even as Halcion faded into obscurity, its chemical cousin took the throne. But the story doesn't end with overdoses. It ends with what these drugs do to the living. The legacy of the Pfizer sleeping pill, whether it's Halcion or its descendants, is a legacy of dependency. Doctors were told these drugs were non-addictive. That was the lie of the 80s, and it bled into the 2000s. They were told you could stop anytime, but if you talk to anyone who has tried to come off a long-term dose of Xanax or Halcion, they will tell you it is harder than kicking heroin. The brain adapts to the drug. The GABA receptors burn out. When you take the drug away, the brain goes into overdrive. Seizures, tinnitus, akathisia, a sensation where you feel like you want to rip your own skin off just to escape the restlessness. We have a generation of people, millions of Americans, who cannot sleep, cannot function, cannot leave their homes without a pill that was invented by a company in Kalamazoo and sold by a conglomerate in New York. And this fits the pattern. We have to look at the entity we are dealing with. In 2009, Pfizer paid the largest criminal fine in U.S. history, $2.3 billion. It was for mispromoting drugs like Bextra and Geodon. The company has a history of pushing the envelope, of taking a drug that is approved for one thing and selling it for everything. With Halshin, they pushed it for long-term sleep despite knowing it caused psychosis. With Xanax, they pushed it for daily stress despite knowing the addiction risks. They took the basic human need for rest, the most vulnerable state a human can be in, and they financialized it. They turned sleep into a subscription service, and the price of that subscription was your brain chemistry. Today, Halshin is still on the market. It's rare, but it's there. The FDA never banned it. They just added a stronger warning label, a label that says it might cause complex sleep behaviors. That's the sanitized term for sleep, driving and sleep, cooking and other things. Xanax is still everywhere. It is a cultural icon. It is in the rap songs. It is in the medicine cabinets. But the victims of the Halshin era, the people who lost their minds, the people who lost their freedom, they are largely forgotten. They are the collateral damage of the quest for the perfect sleep. We focus so much on the drugs that get you high. We focus on the cocaine and the heroin, but we forget about the drugs that are supposed to bring you down, the drugs that are supposed to be safe, because they come from a doctor. Ilo Grunberg said it best after she was released, after she realized that a pill had made her kill her own mother. She said, "I am not a criminal. I am a consumer." That is the terrifying truth in the eyes of Big Pharma. We are all just consumers. And if the product is defective, if the product makes you crazy, well, that's just a line item on a balance sheet. That's just the cost of doing business. Pfizer, Upjohn, the Sacklers. The names change, but the playbook remains the same. Find a human pain point, create a chemical fix, hide the side effects, and sell, sell, sell. So tonight, when you can't sleep, when you're staring at the ceiling and wishing for an off switch, just remember, the off switch has a price. And sometimes you don't wake up the same person who went to sleep. The story of Halshin is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the benzodiazepine trap. But there is another drug, a drug that Pfizer pushed even harder, a drug that they paid the largest fine in history for lying about. It wasn't a sleeping pill. It was a pain pill called Bextra. If you want to see how Pfizer tried to hide the heart attacks and how the DOJ finally caught them, you need to watch this video right here. It explains the $23 billion settlement that everyone seems to have forgotten. Click it now. Stay lucid.